listening to Margins and Meaning with John Wilson.
Well, welcome back to Margins and Meaning. I'm your host, John Wilson. This is the start of episode 8, and I wanted to thank you once again for sharing some time with me. I do have a favor to ask of you right in the beginning here. I would really hope that you could like and subscribe and share this with your friends. I'd really like to grow this footprint. It is quite daunting to try to grow an audience. I think that there's some things of value here that I am sharing, and I'd love it to get to the right ears. So let's get started. Today, I'm going to share another story-based episode here. And the name of this episode, I'm going to call it The Place I Wanted to Be. So, there was this time, a very specific time when I really thought that I had arrived in this trade. The staff and I were having a potluck because we had just wrapped up a record-setting month. It's one of those months that you're supposed to celebrate. We hit a personal best and when you're first starting out, you wonder if these types of months will ever happen to you. Well, it did. And I remember the setting, quite clearly. Lab was quiet. The staff had already left for the day, and I sent them home early after that potluck. I wanted everybody to get their weekend started as a little bit of a thank you for their diligence. The lights were low in this office of mine. The hum of the building had really settled into that familiar after-hours silence. That really odd sense that you have when you're sitting in a quiet laboratory. Well, that was this evening in question. I had the numbers spread out in front of me, and I was sitting there contemplating a few things. The truth is I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even really smiling about it all. You see, I was reflecting on the fact that now I had this larger staff than I ever thought I would achieve. I had this national footprint, and I had cases coming in from all over the country. But for once, the accounts receivable was current. My bills were paid. We had a little extra money in the business account. And by every traditional measure, this is what I thought success was. If you had asked me years earlier when I was grinding and the things were so flippin' uncertain, when I was just telling myself every week, hey, let's just get to the next level, I would have said without hesitation that, yeah, this is exactly what success looks like. This is what I want. But sitting there that night, something just was off. I didn't feel right. Because when I reflect on a few things, the truth is when you have no real plan, no roadmap for this future you actually want, somehow, some way, you still somehow arrive exactly where you were aiming. But here's the real problem, guys, and that reflection was this. When that happens, you don't stop to ask yourself what it really cost you to get there. You don't audit that journey. You don't question what you traded away. You don't even think about what you exchanged for progress. You just keep moving. You just keep building. And the worst thing about it, you just keep justifying things. And that night, sitting there at that desk with the lights dim, I remember as I was staring at those numbers, I realized something super uncomfortable. By all accounts, I did build something from nothing. Something maybe some people would say is impressive. But I wasn't sure I'd built something healthy for myself. And worse, I wasn't sure I built something that honored the vision of myself I thought I was becoming. Because that moment, the first time I understood that success doesn't always arrive with this celebratory situation, sometimes it just shows up late on a Friday night in a quiet little office and asks you one real question that maybe you're not even really ready to answer. Guys, there's another part of all of this that isn't easy to talk about. It really isn't fun to look back and really reflect on how transparent things were. But in the time when things were going well, really well, people start telling you how impressed they are with you. Those clients congratulate you. The peers that you have in this trade would ask you how you're doing it. Somehow you get labeled as the guy that figured it all out. And that kind of affirmation, well, it's intoxicating. Who wouldn't like that? Because when the outside world is applauding, it gets a hell of a lot easier to ignore what's really quietly happening at home. You start mistaking that recognition for alignment, respect for fulfillment. And when the people that depend on you, when your name is attached to something bigger than yourself, kind of feels selfish to question it. So you don't. You accept that praise, you keep moving forward, and you tell yourself that doubt is just weakness leaving the body. Looking back, it wasn't arrogance. It was the trajectory. It was the momentum that I was on. And that momentum, guys, it's dangerous. Because I can tell you this much, it never, ever asked for permission. So what did it really cost me? Those are the questions. When you're building something, especially when it's growing, there's a little lie that you start to believe. The lie is that everything you're sacrificing is just temporary. You tell yourself that this is just a busy season, or once we stabilize, I'll get that time back, or once I hit this number, well, things will eventually calm down. And for a long time, that belief kind of works. Because the business rewards you for it, right? You get more cases coming in, more people depend on you, more responsibility gets stacked quietly on your shoulders. And then, without realizing it, your identity starts to shift. You stop being that person who owns a business and you become the person who holds everything together. I told myself I was doing the right things, that these long hours meant security, that the stress meant commitment, and that the sacrifice that I was giving meant that I was leading my team. What I didn't want to admit, at least not then, was that this business had started to consume the parts of my life that certainly didn't show up on a spreadsheet. My marriage was failing. My children weren't getting the father that I certainly wanted to be. And instead of slowing down and asking hard questions, I did what I always did, especially when things got painful. I just doubled down. I justified the imbalance by pointing to the results. I surrounded myself with teams, with clients, with responsibility, with people who needed me. Because somehow that felt productive. That felt honorable. But the truth is, that just gave me a place to hide. I told myself I was providing for my family, that I was protecting the people that depended on me most, and that this was the true cost of building something real. But guys, here's the truth I couldn't avoid forever. The business that I gave everything to was costing me things that I should have valued most. And that the hardest part wasn't admitting that I was losing them. The hardest part was realizing how good I'd become at explaining it all away. It's funny, as you age, you are much more hard on yourself. You look back with, a very, very fine and focused eye. I put labels on myself along the way. Back in the day, I thought I was this numbers guy, believing in the metrics and the accountability of it all and understanding what things really cost. But here's the one thing that nobody talks about. You see, some of these costs in your life don't show up on a balance sheet. There's no column for presents. There's no line item for the dinners that you missed. No depreciation schedule for the relationships that slowly wear down. And because I couldn't measure those things, I treated them like variables that I could fix later. I assumed I could make it up somehow. That time was on my side, that I was flexible with it all, that people would understand. That math worked. Worked for a long time. Until it didn't. And by the time I realized what I was upside down on, I can tell you this. That interest had already compounded tenfold. So the moment that really became real, guys, there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and feeling it hit you straight in the chest. For a long time, that imbalance in my life existed as just background noise, something that I just acknowledged, but, I didn't fully confront it. Until that background noise wasn't just in the background anymore. When the sharp pains of reality finally surfaced and when my personal life could no longer be managed or explained away, I was forced to face something I had been avoiding. I couldn't fix any of this, at least not in the same way I fixed the problems at work. You see, there's no spreadsheet for this, no process improvements, no late night that I could pull an all-nighter that would make it better. The life I had built, the one that looked so successful from the outside, was unraveling in ways I couldn't control. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could let this break me. Or I could do what I've always done when everything falls apart. I'd just pick up the damn pieces. And I'd choose a different direction. You see, I didn't walk away from the work. I didn't abandon the responsibility. But I did stop pretending that endurance alone was my greatest virtue. You see, the choices I talked about in the last episode about controlling the AR, by being deliberate, by picking and choosing the teams that I aligned with, those weren't just business strategies. They were actually my survival strategy. You see, they were my attempt to bring my life back into alignment, to find some common ground between the man I was professionally and maybe the man that I wanted to be personally. I fought hard to honor the people that stood by me through all of this, to be present where I'd once been absent, to stop confusing this sacrifice with my own personal worth. And when the harsh reality of my new life finally settled in, I realized something I'm generally proud of. I just didn't quit. I stayed the course. I learned from the pain instead of numbing it. I made hard choices. I moved to a new location. I reset my priorities. And for the first time in a long time, I honored me, my needs. So let's talk about balance, that mythical relationship between work life and personal life. Back in the day, I thought balance meant that I had to do less. And it was something that people talked about like it was some sort of destination, that you could achieve it by reaching this point. I could never see that point. I never saw how to get there. I wanted to find a path desperately. But no, I couldn't. Today, I think balance is something completely different. I think that it's something that you have to renegotiate constantly. sometimes daily, sometimes making those painful decisions. Back in the day, there was seasons where I told myself that this imbalance was noble, that it meant that this grind that I was carrying meant that I cared more, maybe. By caring, really caring, it certainly doesn't excuse yourself from disappearing from your life. And what I learned, the real hard way of it all, is that balance wasn't about doing less, like I said. It's about choosing more deliberately. Who in your life gets your best hours? Who gets your energy when it matters? When it's time to stop proving something to people that really aren't even keeping score anyway. When you can recognize that, maybe, just maybe, you found some sort of balance. So let's contemplate on what I know now. So I used to think that success was about how much I could really carry, how much responsibility I could shoulder, how much pressure I could absorb without breaking. And I wore those things like armor. But what I know now is this. Strength isn't measured by how long you can stay overloaded. It's measured by whether the life that you're building still belongs to you. For a long time, I confused motion with progress, growth with some sort of fulfillment, and endurance with the purpose of it all. And I like to think a lot of us do this, especially people who build things from nothing. We get really good at surviving, so good, in fact, that I think we forget to ask what we're really surviving for. You see, I don't regret the work. I don't regret the sacrifices because they really taught me who I am. But I no longer believe that the success should require you to abandon yourself in the process. If the life you're building costs you your presence, your relationship, your inner peace, then at some point it might be worth asking whether that definition really needs to change. For me, that question didn't come in a moment of failure. It came on a Friday afternoon with undeniable success. When the numbers said I had arrived, but everything else told me I hadn't. You see, guys, this isn't a warning. It's just an observation from someone who's been on both sides of that ledger. You guys, build carefully. Pay attention to those quiet moments. And don't wait too long to ask yourself what this is all really costing you. Because success will take what you let it take. Don't fool yourself. Well, episode 8 is almost complete. I thank you for listening to this point. As I reflect upon the words that I've shared with you today, regret is a common term. But I don't want this to be a regret story, guys. I don't sit here wishing I had done nothing or built less or cared less about the day-to-day. Everything I shared today has shaped me in some way. It's really taught me endurance. It's taught me discipline. But what it really has taught me is what I'm capable of when things get super difficult. And that matters. But today, guys, I want to talk about awareness. Because once you see the cost clearly, once you can actually name it, you're no longer just a victim of it. You're actually the participant at that point. Because there's a difference between being driven and being awake. Most people in this life never really build anything meaningful because they're afraid of the weight of it all. If you're sitting here listening to this part and it resonates with you, well, that means that you did carry the weight. You're connected with this. That's not failure. That's proof of strength. I think the mistake isn't working hard. The mistake is believing that you're not allowed to actually change the rules once you've proven you can. You don't owe this world your exhaustion. You don't owe your past self a repeat performance. You don't have to burn everything down to the damn ground to rebuild it better. You're allowed to recalibrate, my friends, to redefine what success looks like now, not what it did 10 years ago. And if nothing else, I hope this episode gives you permission to pause. Just long enough to ask yourself a better question than, how much more of this life can I actually take? Maybe the real question is, what do I want this to feel like moving forward? Thank you. Hey, what the hell are you still doing here? Well, as long as you're here, before I go, just to be clear, this episode's not a formal apology to anybody but myself. Maybe you might see it as a midlife crisis or some request for sympathy, and that's not the case, guys. No furniture was thrown at the wall, no motorcycles or Corvettes were purchased. Oh, wait, that happened. And I didn't quit my job just to find myself. What this is just one man, a microphone, and a few hard-earned observations shared with you so you don't have to learn them the hard, long way. Please take them for what they are. Enjoy. Talk to you soon.